All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi, for making the time for us. One quick note that I'll add to the intro is this is the second book club that I've done on the Palestine-Israel conflict this summer. And for both book clubs, we decided to have a set of books that people could vote on after signing up. And among Dr. Khalidi's book, we had other, extremely well revered books from Noam Chomsky, Ian Papp, and both times this Hundred Years' War book won out pretty convincingly. So I think that's not a coincidence, and it's not an accident. And for those of you who have read this book in the summer, I think you appreciate why Dr. Khalidi is so appreciated in this landscape. And so, without any further ado, we're just going to get right into some of the questions and get through as many of them as we can and give the floor to Dr. Khalidi. So, Dr. Khalidi, in the novel, The Hundred Years' War on Palestine, you end the first chapter, the introduction, by stating that, quote, many people cannot accept the contradiction inherent in the idea that although Zionism undoubtedly succeeded in creating a thriving national entity in Israel, its roots are as a colonial settler project. Nor can they accept that it would not have succeeded but for the support of the great imperial powers, Britain and later the United States. In what ways do you think that Israel is a traditional colonial project vis-a-vis the British in India or the French in Algeria? And in what ways, if any, do you think that it is a unique entity or project? And if so, what are the most important elements that separate it from those other examples?
Right. Thanks. That's actually a very important question. Um, the book's not a novel. I wish it were fiction, but unfortunately, it's nonfiction. um, and it's all, as far as I can tell, as realistic a description of the history as I could produce. I think that that's a really important question because we're often told, well, how can you talk about this as a settler colonial project? It's a refuge for persecuted Jews. How can you talk about it as a settler colonial project when there is this, thriving national entity? How can you talk about it as a settler colonial project when there's a biblical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel? And according to some claims, Israelis are indigenous to the region. And all of those things, except the indigeneity part, the historic connection, the national entity that's been created there, and the idea of a Jewish state as a refuge for persecuted European Jews, all of those things are in fact important elements of Israel's identity. They don't in any way contradict the settler colonial nature of Israel. A state can be a settler colonial project and a national entity. I mean, you all are in Maryland, named for Queen Mary. I don't believe Queen Mary ever lived in Maryland. It was an indigenous population that was destroyed or driven out, which lived there before the English arrived. It's a settler colonial project, the United States. It's a national project at the same time. Many of the people who arrived in North America were in fact persecuted, the Puritans, the Quakers, and so on. So Israel being a refuge for people who are persecuted, or Israel having developed as a national entity, in no way contradicts its settler colonial nature, nor, in fact, does the fact that there is a historic connection between the Jewish religion and the Jews or Jewish people and the land of Israel. That does not make the process whereby Israel was established any less a settler colonial project. It was seen by its founders as such. I go at great length in the book, and I could have gone in much greater length, into how Herzl and Weizmann and Zev Jabotinsky and other early Zionist leaders saw what they were doing as a European colonial project, saw themselves as settlers, saw themselves as colonizers. I quote Jabotinsky in particular because he was the bluntest of all early Zionist leaders about this. And I think if you follow the course of not just the early phases when Zionists saw themselves as European settlers colonizing a non-European land, obviously with a historic claim to it in their view, with the objective of establishing a national entity. But they saw themselves as settlers. They wouldn't have had a land purchase agency called the Jewish Colonization Agency, JCA, if they hadn't saw themselves as colonizers. So they were colonizers, and they saw themselves as colonizers, even though they had this national objective, even though there was this religious connection, and even though this was seen as a refuge from persecution. Now, how does it differ from other colonial projects? It differs a great deal. Most others start off as extension. Well, first of all, there are settler colonies and there are colonies of occupation. Algeria was a settler colony. Libya was a settler colony. South Africa was a settler colony. India, Egypt were not. These were places ruled by a very few, or French Indochina, were not settler colonies. They were colonies of occupation. Palestine falls into the former category, the idea of the category of settler colonialism, rather than a few British or French or Belgian or whatever officials ruling over a huge mass of natives without the importation of a European population to take their place. There are other important differences between Israel and every other settler colonial project. It is unique in many respects, but that does not make it any less of a settler colonial project. And the last thing I would say is what has happened in the Galilee and the Negev since 1948, with people being driven out of their lands, the land being taken over, Jewish settlers being implanted there, and what has been happening in the West Bank since 1967 is proof that this settler colonial nature of the Zionist project was not just something in the distant past. It is the characteristic, a central characteristic of the Israeli state today. You have Israeli ministers talking about resettling Gaza. It's a settler colonialism in their own, I mean, just taking their words as evidence.
Yeah, thank you. I guess just a quick follow-up to that. The early founders of Israel, I think you rightly pointed out, were very honest about the European settler colonial nature of their project. So why do you think it is that now in 2024 and for the last several decades, when people think of this issue in general, that is so far in the periphery, and specifically the only thing that's highlighted is the religious nature of the conflict,
Right.
to the point where I think many people, many professors at universities and people in our positions are afraid to teach about the subject, to talk about the subject, to show up to anything related to this, because they're afraid of the connection that has been made between Judaism and Zionism and the tension that naturally exists there now.
Right. I mean, one way of describing this is gaslighting. What you see before your eyes is not true. What we're telling you is true. This fabricated lie of indigeneity, this fabricated lie of ancient Israel is the same as modern Israel. I mean, these are any historian, any anthropologist, any archaeologist will tell you that these things are not connected. This is a modern national project. It's also a modern settler colonial project. It has absolutely nothing to do with ancient Israel. And whoever the people who came to this new project were, in the first instance, almost entirely Europeans, the fact that they may or may not have had a connection thousands of years ago doesn't give them title, or the whole world would be turned upside down. Muslims would rule Spain. Germans would rule France. I mean, by which I mean the Gauls and the various Germanic tribes. This is an absurd projection into the modern era of basically biblical mythology. The problem is people are intimidated because any critique of the state of Israel or of Israeli policies is taken as anti-Semitic. And that's a huge club to hold over people's heads. I find it absolutely ludicrous. If the people who came to settle and colonize Palestine were persecuted, religiously driven Danes, would opposition and resistance to this settler colonialism be anti-Christian? Of course it wouldn't. It would be opposition to this theft of your country by a bunch of European foreigners, which is exactly what's happening in Palestine. Whether they were Martians, whether they were green, whether they were Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, wouldn't have made any difference. They were taking over the country to establish their own national entity. as a refuge for persecution and on the basis of a religious claim of thousands of years ago. But the essential reality was colonization, expulsion, dispossession. And that's what's being reacted to. And it's hard to push back against this, I understand. But I think it's really important because this is a nation state. The fact that it describes itself as a Jewish state doesn't make what it does any less objectionable, and doesn't make critique of what it does anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. Pivoting, I guess, from there to the American perspective to this conflict, I think often it's argued that Americans shouldn't get involved with global conflicts that seem so distant or far away and don't impact their average day-to-day lives in a way that is meaningful. As it relates to Palestine, how would you react to this critique, which we often hear? And I guess just a follow-up to that is, no, I'll let you answer that actually first.
I mean, one of the central arguments of the book, and I think one of the central facts of history, is that you wouldn't have Israel if it were not for Britain and the United States. Very simply put, Israel is a creation of British policy in the first instance and has been maintained and sustained and supported and protected by the United States, at least for the past 60 or so years. It could not exist as it does. It could not do what it does without those external supports. The United States and Great Britain are involved. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, they are waging war on the Palestinians on behalf of this client state of theirs. Britain helped to create it, and the United States has sustained and maintained it. And this is not, just a minor issue of a vote every 6 months in the UN Security Council. Every bomb dropped in Palestine is an American bomb. Every plane bombing Palestine is an American plane. Every helicopter firing rockets into Palestine is an American helicopter. So the United States is up to its elbows in the blood of Palestinians. Every person being killed, with some exceptions, obviously the people being shot, may be shot by Israelis with Israeli manufactured automatic weapons, but the heavy artillery, the planes, the ammunition, the helicopters are entirely American. Every single one of them is manufactured in the United States and is paid for by us, American taxpayers. We pay billions of dollars a year. In fact, a $20 billion deal has just been signed, an additional one yesterday by the Biden administration. We pay billions of dollars a year in our taxes to ensure that Israel can continue to slaughter Palestinians and can continue to dominate the Middle East. We are involved up to our elbows in blood. It's not a matter of over there. It's not a matter of this is them and not us. This is us. This is the United States involved in slaughtering people in Palestine. The United States has sustained and maintained the starvation of Gaza. The United States has sustained and maintained the deprivation of medical assistance to people in Gaza. The United States has been responsible for almost every weapon system, certainly the planes and the artillery and the helicopters are all American without exception. Every 155 millimeter artillery piece, every 175 millimeter artillery piece, every F-15, F-16, F-35 is American. American made and paid for by you and me, our taxes. So the United States is up to its armpits in this. This is not an Israeli war. This is an Israeli, American, European war on the Palestinians, going right back to the Balfour Declaration, going back to the League of Nations, a creation of the victorious European powers of World War I, and going back to the United Nations, a creation of the victorious powers of World War II. They and the great powers that dominated those instances created Israel. Israel's birth certificate is a UN General Assembly resolution that the United States and the Soviet Union pushed through with bribes and with arm twisting. You would not have had the partition of Palestine, but for the United States and the Soviet Union. So this is American involvement at the highest level, and without which none of this would have happened, or certainly wouldn't have happened in the way it's happened. These are not might have beens of history. These are absolute certainties of history. So we are involved. We want to pretend we're not. This administration and previous ones have tried to pretend that this is somewhere else. It's not somewhere else. It's where we are, and it's what we are doing as Americans.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's difficult for people within the US to grasp often is how the rest of the world perceives everything that you just said. And so I think as it becomes fairly evident that the annals of history will write the current genocide in Palestine as an American genocide as much as an Israeli genocide. You've traveled a lot in the last 10 months and you've talked to people all over the world. How do you think the US's reputation and global standing and hegemony in the region is going to be impacted because of not something that just started now, but has been happening for decades, but now is magnified to such a degree that you can't deny what is right in front of your eyes. And how long do you think this effect will be?
Well, I don't know how long this effect will be, but there's no question that the United States has reached a nadir, a low point, in terms of its reputation and its standing in the Middle East. But I would argue in the world as a whole. I don't think this is just seen as a Middle Eastern issue. I think that it impacts the nauseating hypocrisy of the United States opposing a recent Russian occupation of parts of Ukraine and sustaining, supporting, arming, and protecting an Israeli occupation of the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza that's gone on since 1967. I mean, where is the standard here? Where is the global rule of law that the United States purports to uphold? Where is this global order? Well, obviously, it doesn't exist. One thing is sauce for the goose, another thing is sauce for the gander. And I think that everybody in the world sees that. The emperor is buck naked, stark naked, has absolutely there's no pretense as far as most of the world is concerned. And I would argue that includes now a majority of Americans and a majority of Europeans, even though the US government and European governments are staunch supporters of whatever Israel does. I mean, they cluck and they bleat and they occasionally emit sounds of distress, but they continue to arm and support whatever Israel does. I mean, they could have forced Israel to let food in. They didn't. They could have forced Israel to let water in. They didn't. They could have forced Israel to stop bombing hospitals. They didn't. And they won't. But public opinion, even in the West, I think sees that as I said, the emperor is completely naked. And that's even more the case in the rest of the world. I mean, there's nobody anywhere in the world, with the exception of a few white settler colonies like Australia and Canada, and then the United States, and a couple of old European imperial powers like France and Britain. And by those, when I talk about those countries, I talk about their elites. I'm not talking about public opinion, because public opinion, at least in the United States and in many parts of Europe, has already shifted and sees things in the same way as most of the rest of the world, which is that the United States is a nauseating hypocrite when it proclaims it opposes occupation, for example, in Ukraine, but not in Palestine. And when it claims to be neutral or to be involved in a so-called peace process, it's not. It's not. It defends Israel at every turn. And people see that. And I think that it has harmed the United States' standing, not just in the Middle East, but globally. How long it'll last, I don't know. I couldn't say.
Yeah, thank you. Returning back to the book, and I think again, just for those who have read it and those who are interested in perhaps reading it in the future, jumping ahead to chapter 4, when you document the Lebanon War of 1982, which is eerie right now with Lebanon starting to be bombed. That war in 1982 resulted in 50,000 people being killed or injured. At the time, the US president was Ronald Reagan, and he ended up referring to that siege of Lebanon as, quote, a Holocaust, and said that the symbol of that war was going to be the picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off, unquote. And in spite of that reality, in due time, Israel was somehow able to clearly rehabilitate its image and global standing prior to October 7th. And so when you look at the current events through that lens and through the history, do you think history will repeat itself, or do you think we've reached a point, and again with things like social media and the documentation, that things are different? And if they are different, why do you think they're different now?
Yeah, that's another really good question because it is true that in the past, Israel has lost American public support. That was true in the 82 war. That was true during the first intifada of the late 1980s, from 1987 until the early 1990s. Public support disappeared in the United States. The image of a Palestinian kid throwing a rock at a tank, or Rabin's order to break the hands of Palestinian children who threw rocks, or going back to 82, the images of Beirut being bombed. All of these things destroyed Israel's image in the United States and in the West. And they assiduously and methodically and systematically and very intelligently rebuilt that image. And I think it's a legitimate question as to whether that might happen this time. I think that they will make an enormous effort to do so, but I think some kind of tipping point may have been reached. It has not yet affected the elites. The media is still as blindly pro-Israel as it ever was, except at the margins. The political class is terrified of Palestine. The people who own our universities and run our universities, the people who run art galleries and museums, cultural institutions, the people who run law firms, the big companies in the United States are all completely committed to Israel, without very few exceptions, in a way that's quite nauseating. On my own campus, overwhelming majorities of faculty voted non-confidence in our president. They pretended we never even had it. It didn't happen. Overwhelming majorities of our students opposed the genocide. They treated them extremely harshly. So the elites haven't changed one bit, or they're still intimidated and afraid to change their position. But public opinion has shifted enormously at every level in the United States and in the West. And I think that some kind of tipping point may have been reached. I think that the fact that AIPAC, for example, is having spent hundreds of millions of dollars to defeat two representatives who are critical of Israel, Jamal Bowman in Westchester and Cori Bush in the St. Louis suburbs, is testament to the fact that they have to go in with bare knuckles in a way that they never had to do in the past. All they had to do was whisper in a few ears, and people were terrified. Anybody who opposed Israel in the past, without exception, Senator Chuck Percy, I could go through Representative Pete McCloskey, dozen or 24 individuals who dared to say something critical of Israel were destroyed politically within a matter of a year or two or three. Senator Abu Razik, I could go on and on. Today, you have dozens of people in Congress who are still critical of Israel and able to stand on their own 2 feet. That's a shift. That's a shift at the level of the base. These people know that they have the votes to stay in office, even if they stand up to AIPAC, even if they continue to criticize Israel. Now, they brought down Bowman. It cost them hundreds of millions of dollars to bring down one New York State congressman, and hundreds of millions of dollars to bring down one congressperson in St. Louis. That's evidence of the fact that they're going to have to use brute force to maintain their position, rather than the gaslighting and the propaganda and the myth making that sustained Israel's support in the past. Now, those myths still have a hold on the aged generation of President Biden and Senator Schumer and Pelosi and those people in their 80s and 70s and 60s. I'm in that age group myself, and I know that my generation and the generation after me believe every myth ever produced by Israel in the main. There are many who don't, obviously. And those people are not going to change. And they constitute the elite. They own most of America. They control our politics. They fund our politicians. They own the media. They run our universities. But you go down a generation or two, and that change is, I would argue, going to be long lasting. I don't know what its effects are going to be, but this is not 1982. It's not 1982 in that we have a president who refused to do what President Reagan did, which is to stop the Israelis. He could have done it 9 months ago, 8 months ago, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, last week. He has refused to do it. He has refused to stop them. And American presidents have stopped Israel multiple times in the past. President Eisenhower did it. President Bush Sr. did it. I could go on and on and on in ways in which American presidents stood up to Israel and got away with it. This man has not done it, has refused to do it. I think that that's one of many, many reasons that he had to step down. The fact that he was clearly incapable of campaigning is the main reason. But the intense opposition in the base of the Democratic Party to this war and to this genocide and to America's hands being covered in blood was one of the many elements in forcing the president to step down. It still hasn't, I think, changed the course of the Democratic Party, but it's evidence of a change, I would argue. And I think there are many other signs of that change. And that this might have been a tipping point, this war, in terms of public opinion.
Yeah, great. Shifting perhaps to academia and life as an academic through this lens, as a professor, as a former professor now, as a Professor Emeritus, what are your thoughts, especially, being associated intimately with Columbia University, on the university encampments that went up last semester related to Palestine, that may very well go up again this fall? Why do you think this doorstep came to the doors? Why do you think this conflict came to the doorstep of academia, while many other conflicts happening right now in the world did not? And then related to that, why did this conflict, has it struck such a major chord with American youth, knowing that the older generations were so lockstep with Israel?
Right, right. I think that there's a ridiculous attempt to say why Israel and Palestine and not other conflicts. And it's absolutely absurd. Is the United States a major participant in the slaughter of the Rohingya? No. Is the United States a major participant in the slaughter of people in Sudan? No. There are atrocities, actually some of them on a level of, and in some cases, even worse than what's happening in Gaza, in which the United States is not involved in any way, manner, or form. The United States is not supporting the Syrian government as it oppresses its own people. Without the United States, Israel could do nothing. We are involved in this war. We are fighting this war. There's a dozen American warships speeding to the Middle East because Israel might be in danger if the war expands. Would we do that to protect the Assad regime? No. Would we do that to protect the Burmese, the Myanmar junta? Of course not. Would we do that to protect any faction in the Sudanese civil war? The comparisons are ludicrous. This is an American war. That's why students are energized and angry about it. Now, as to why the younger generations, and they're right, it's our tax dollars, it's our country, it's our planes, our bombs, our money, our Security Council vetoes, without which Israel could do nothing of the sort that it's doing. As to why younger people are in a different place than older people, I don't want to overemphasize the role of social media. But I would contrast that with the absolute contempt that younger people have for the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. Unlike older people who would watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC or whatever they may watch and read the Baltimore Sun or the New York Times or whatever. I don't know any students who consume any of those media, and I have not known for 10 years. I used to be able 25 years ago to mention a front page article in the New York Times, and a third of the class would nod their heads. They would have seen a major item on a major issue that same day. That is inconceivable today. Nobody under 30 knows anything about what's on CNN or anything that's in the New York Times. And if you ask them about them and say, why would I look at that trash? Why would I look at that garbage? It's all lies. So they know, first of all, they've seen through the myth of the objectivity of the US media on this and many other issues. And secondly, they have alternative means of accessing reality. And thanks to that, they are seeing things far better, I think, than their elders, who are unfortunately restricted to the poisonous offerings of the mainstream media. Now, I think that's why this issue, arrived on campus. And I think that is the reason that it's going to continue to affect campuses going into the fall, assuming the war is not brought to an end. I'm not looking forward. I'm actually going to be teaching again in the fall. I'm retired, but they've asked me to come back and teach one of my big lecture courses. My department has. And I'm not looking forward to it. I'm very worried about what's going to happen on campus because of the vicious repression that the administration has engaged in ever since October 7th. and because of the overwhelming opposition of at least most of the arts and sciences faculty and of most of the undergraduates to university policies and to this genocide. I have no comments on the tactics that the students engaged in. I was involved in the anti-war movement when I was an undergraduate. I was involved in the support movement for the Black Panthers. I was an undergraduate at Yale, and there was a big Black Panther chapter up on the Hill in New Haven. I was opposed to the draft. They were drafting everybody in those days to go fight in Vietnam. And we didn't listen to our elders. We did whatever we wanted. We had some really, important, prominent leaders of the anti-war movement come and speak to us. William Sloane Coffin was the chaplain at Yale. All kinds of other really important. Tom Hayden came and spoke to us. We didn't listen to them. We did whatever we wanted. And the students are doing whatever they want, good, bad, indifferent. And I don't comment on it. They don't ask me for advice. They don't take my advice. They don't listen to us. We have a very active faculty group supporting the students, but utterly uninvolved in what the students do. And that's their business. I mean, I wish they would listen to me sometimes, but they won't. And, I'm reconciled to that. I think universities have acted as shamefully today as they did during the McCarthy era. These people will go down in infamy. People like the president of Columbia, people like the president of Harvard, people like almost every university administrator right now. There are a few exceptions. Their behavior has been contemptible. Their behavior has been cowardly. Their behavior has been in opposition to every moral value imaginable. The number of people who have been slaughtered in the academic institutions in Gaza is mind-boggling. The number of 7 of dozens and dozens of university buildings in Gaza have remained untouched. Hundreds have been either completely destroyed or damaged. Nobody says anything in American universities about this. I think it's scandalous myself. And they will be very poorly treated by history, I promise you. This is not an honorable approach. They're terrified of being attacked from the right. They're terrified of the Republican Party, which has picked up this issue, obviously. They're terrified of donors, the vocal donors. They're terrified of some vocal alumni. They're terrified of vocal parents. They're terrified of a tiny minority of students, a minority probably of Jewish students, not of students. I would argue you probably had more undergraduates who of a Jewish background involved in the protests against Israel's war than you had supporting Israel on my campus anyway. So it has nothing to do with Jewish students. It has to do with a tiny vocal pro-Israel minority of students. And both sides see this in absolute terms. From one perspective, this is absolutely legitimate self-defense, and nothing Israel does can be criticized. And from the other perspective, it's genocide. And it's a black and white issue. And the absurdity of what administrators are trying to do, calling for dialogue and discussion, I find ludicrous. I've been invited to speak at Harvard together with Benny Morris, someone who called Palestinians, what he said they're barbarians and they should be kept in cages. I wouldn't be on a platform with that man if my life depended on it. I've been invited to speak on a platform with Alan Dershowitz. This is the administrator's idea of how to deal with this conflict. It's like asking slaves to get on a platform and talk to slave owners. It's like asking Armenians to get on a platform and talk to the Young Turks. This is not amenable to that kind of adjudication. And that's what they're trying to do because they're cowards, because they have no principles, because they're terrified. They are contemptible beyond belief, in my view. Most administrators whose actions I've followed anyway.
Yeah, I think we could go at length just talking about the how,
I'm sure you guys have your own experiences, as does every academic I know.
Yeah. Just to allow the colleagues to have time to speak with you as well, maybe I'll get out with one question. I'm not going to ask you to predict what's going to come next. I just have a more specific question about, as you said, the American warships are speeding towards the Mediterranean right now. They say it's because of a response to Iranian aggression towards Israel and to be ready to defend Israel. when in reality, it's plain as day that Israel is trying to essentially force Iran into a broader war, whether that's through the assassination of Hania, in the presidential compound of Iran, which if that happened in any other country, that country would be at war immediately. The bombing of Tehran during Soleimani's funeral, again the bombing of Beirut, and so I think I've read enough analysis to be sympathetic to the viewpoint that the reason Israel is essentially trying to force an Iranian response, which would then force an American response, is because it needs that regional, at minimum, regional war, and perhaps a broader war than that, to essentially flip the table and have people forget about the genocide. Because when it becomes a war of that proportion, that's the only way to forget about what's happened over the last 10 months. I guess my question is, the trajectory that we're on, do you see any way of avoiding that? Because the Iranians, regardless of what people think of them, they have been restrained. They haven't responded when other countries would have responded. But surely they have a limit. Having a foreign dignitary being assassinated in your presidential compound, I don't see how they cannot react. And if they don't react forcefully enough, then they essentially become a laughingstock. So this tit for tat, this back and forth, how does it not end in a very large regional or global war?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that there's no unified view in Israel. The prime minister and most of his government and a number of people in the military, but a minority of the general staff, are intent on dragging the United States into a wider Middle Eastern war. They are determined to have the United States fight Iran for them. And Netanyahu's tried this before. He tried it in the 1990s. No, it wasn't the 90s. It was under Obama. And Obama, the American military, the American intelligence community, and the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence community basically told the prime minister to go to hell. You cannot do this. And the American military has war gamed this. And from my personal knowledge, has been told unequivocally the United States cannot win a war with Iran. So the United States does not want this war, and Netanyahu does. I don't think most of the Israeli general staff wants it, and I don't think the Israeli intelligence community wants it, because they understand what the American military understands. This will be a catastrophe for the region, for the United States, but also for Israel. Such a regional war will be devastating. I mean, this war so far has harmed Israel immeasurably, but an expansion of it would be even worse. But Netanyahu has other calculations. He doesn't want to be tried, and he doesn't want to lose power. He has a ridiculously right-wing coalition that wants war, for apocalyptic end times reasons, by the way, for some of the extreme right-wingers in that government. Now, I'm not going to predict what's going to happen. Iran doesn't want this. The United States doesn't want this. European countries don't want this. Most Middle Eastern countries don't want this. So I think that it's going to be a test of wills between Netanyahu and his own military and the United States and everybody else who really doesn't want this to happen. So far, it looks like we're moving towards a war, a larger war. But the array of forces that fundamentally oppose the idea of a wider war is pretty formidable. So I don't know how this is going to go. In these kinds of circumstances, what one side or one individual or one leader wants may not determine outcomes. It may be an accident that will determine an outcome. And World War I was not started by people wanting World War I. It started by accident.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's just alarming because I think all of the people and the parties that you mentioned, the US, the Europeans, they also wouldn't have wanted this genocide to drag on for 10 months. Even the Democratic Party is not being helped by this, but here we are. And so that's kind of what I was saying is I find it hard to believe that Netanyahu, and he's often referred to as a centrist within his own coalition, will just go away because
he's a centrist. I'm the king of Spain.
Yeah. Anyways, we have some time, and I know people are probably dying to ask you questions. So perhaps, Carrie, we can just allow people I think you'd rather unmute and speak, so feel free. I don't know if you want to put up your hands or just go ahead and we'll try to get through as much as we can. Does that sound okay, Carrie? And I'm going to perhaps stop the recording now, Carrie. Yeah? Okay.